Hey everyone, welcome back to Simple and Sacred, where theology is made simple. I'm so glad to be back on the podcast. I've been sick for the past few weeks, and so I'm thankful to be feeling better, thankful to be back with you, and I'm so excited about what God has for us in this episode, but also in episodes to come. I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear how God is using the podcast to draw you closer to Himself, but I'd also love to hear your thoughts, your ideas, maybe your disagreements as we're going through these studies. So drop a comment and let's get a discussion going on all of these passages and ideas. I just would really love to hear from you. We are going to dive into another name for God today, which is Jehovah Rapha. In the last episode, we talked about the difference between Yahweh and Jehovah. So if you haven't had a chance to check out that episode, I recommend that you do that before listening to this one. But today's name for God is Jehovah Rapha, which means the Lord who heals you. And it was really interesting studying this name for God as I've been really sick the past few weeks. But just like with every other name that we've studied so far, there's so much more going on beneath the surface. And I hope and I pray that I'll be able to break it down in a way that's understandable and simple. So the name Jehovah Rapha, we find this name in Exodus 15. The last name that we studied was Jehovah Jireh, and that was all the way back in Genesis 22. So there's a pretty big gap here in between these two names. So God revealed himself to Abraham as El Shaddai, and he doesn't give Isaac or Jacob a different name for himself. He even said to Moses in Exodus 3 that El Shaddai was the name that he revealed to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. El Shaddai is God's covenant-keeping name. He is all-sufficient to bring about his plan of redemption, and it was going to be through Abraham's descendants. And he's going to be faithful to fulfill his promises to bless all the families in the earth through this family. And this was going to be both in the short term, in that Abraham's family, Israel, was going to show the nations who Yahweh was by the way that they lived, by the way that they worshiped. But then ultimately, in the long end, it's going to be that God is going to fulfill these promises through Jesus, who is going to eventually come and he is going to defeat sin as the serpent crusher. So as we've already learned in Exodus 3, God reveals himself to Moses as Yahweh. And this is God's personal, intimate name that he gives his people. This is the name that shows that he is intimately involved with his people, that he offers his presence, his power, and his promises to his people. He's the God who walks in the dust with his people and dwells with his people. So then we have the account of the Exodus itself. God's people were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And then God eventually, finally brings Moses to deliver his people. And through the 10 plagues, God shows his power over the gods of the Egyptians. And I've mentioned it before, but we're eventually going to go through all of these stories in the Bible. We're going to hit all of them and go deeper into all of them. But I just want to highlight something here. If we eliminate the supernatural from the Bible, it makes the Bible a lot more difficult to understand. A story like the 10 plagues is hard for us to grasp when we see that it's God himself who's delivering this judgment upon the Egyptians. But when you understand the cosmic battle that's taking place, this cosmic battle that's going on between the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light, you're going to see things from a much bigger perspective. The plagues were direct attacks on the Egyptian gods. And so there's something very real and there's something much bigger than we realize going on through all of that. But we will get to that eventually. So here's where we get to our name for today. God has just set his people free from slavery in Egypt after 400 years. He brings them through the Red Sea, and then Moses and his sister Miriam both sing these beautiful, powerful worship songs. And Moses' song ends with these words: "You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord, Yahweh, will reign forever and ever." Exodus 15, 17 through 18. The people are excited, and rightly so. I mean, think about it for a second. They have just been delivered from the superpower of their day. It was miraculous. It was unbelievable. They walked across the sea on dry land. They watched their enemies swallowed by these walls of water that they had just walked through. And there's so much theological meaning and depth to everything that's going on here. In the Bible, water is symbolic for chaos and judgment, but also in the ancient Egyptian religion, the waters of the Red Sea were seen as the border to the underworld. So past the sea is chaos and wilderness, and the water is the underworld. So the Egyptians have received God's judgment, and the Israelites are brought from death to new life. The crossing of the Red Sea is like a baptism that they have walked from slavery into new life as God's people. They have been saved. They have been set free. But their rejoicing very quickly turns sour. In Exodus 15:22 through 24, it says, "Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah, because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, 'What shall we drink?'" So this wilderness of Shur, it's mentioned prior to this story in Genesis 16, and it's the story of Hagar. And this is the story where Hagar, she is the Egyptian slave who, instead of Abraham and Sarah waiting for their promise from God and Isaac, instead they take matters into their own hands, and Abraham takes Hagar as his wife and has Ishmael with Hagar. Well, Hagar runs to the wilderness because she's mistreated by Sarah. And it's in this wilderness of Shur that God finds her, that he gives her a promise, and she calls God El Roi, the God who sees her. So this wilderness of Shur, the name Shur, it means wall or walled enclosure. And Exodus 14:22 says, "And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left." So this idea of being walled in, we look at this picture of the Red Sea, of how these waters came up and were walls around them. That's the idea of this wilderness, that they're walled in. So the wilderness of Shur was a desolate, unforgiving desert landscape with limited water resources. It was characterized by hilly and sandy terrain and was known for being a place of hardship and struggle. So the Israelites have just come through the Red Sea, where the walls of water were their protection. And here they are in the wilderness of Shur, this place that actually means walled enclosure. They're surrounded by the walls of the wilderness. They're walled in by sand, by thirst, by disappointment, and by fear, because it's been 3 days, and a human body can only go 3 days without water. So you can imagine they're in a dire situation here. They are literally going to die of thirst if they don't get some water. And here they come upon some water, and they can't drink it because it's bitter. Now, I know that I tell us all the time not to put ourselves in the story first, but I do want us to just imagine for a moment what these people are going through, because it's easy for us to say, "Why didn't you just trust God? You had just seen this amazing miracle. Why would you not believe that he was going to provide for you?" But they are on the brink of death here, and God leads them to bitter water that they can't drink. And so it says here that they grumble against God and against Moses. And the Hebrew word here is loon, and it means to murmur. And so there's this repetitive nature. Just the word murmur is repetitive in its letters. But it means to lodge, to stay the night, to dwell permanently, to remain or tarry. So you can see this word picture here. They're not just saying a passing, "Oh man, this is a bummer." They're remaining in this state of grumbling, of murmuring, this repetition of grumbling against God. It's been 3 days with no water. Is God playing some cruel joke on them? We can't skip over the severity of this situation. God has led them to what seems like a sure death. And so what's God's response here? In verse 25 it says, "And Moses cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." And that's our word right there. Jehovah Rapha, the Lord your healer. So, if you were to do a study on this passage, we as Christians immediately see, oh, Moses is putting a log. That word log is actually tree. This tree is going into the water. The bitter waters are made sweet. And so it's very easy for us to make this connection with Jesus, that Jesus is what makes our bitter water sweet. He died on the cross, which is also known as a tree. But before we get to that, I want to first look at what would an ancient Israelite have been thinking. What would the original audience of the book of Exodus have been thinking? Because it wouldn't have been Jesus. And so again, we always want to first ask, what did it mean to them before we ask, what does it mean to us? So this log or this tree, it's actually connected to the following statement that God gives. God tells them, he throws the log in the water. Moses throws the log or the tree in the water. And then God says that he made for them a statute and a rule. And he says, if you will diligently listen to me, if you will do what is right in my eyes and give ear to my commandments and keep all my statutes, then none of the diseases that I put on the Egyptians will fall on you, for I am the Lord your healer. So God is connecting this log, this tree, with his law, that is what is going to make his people's bitter waters sweet. And so this brings us back to the Garden of Eden. Here we have a tree and God's law, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, of God saying, don't eat from this tree. Follow my way. Follow my words. And it's the law that God is saying that he's going to heal his people through. Psalm 19, 7-9 says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." God hasn't given them his law yet. They haven't made it to Sinai yet. That's coming. But what he's saying is, if you follow my way, if you listen to my voice, if you obey my commands, that's where your healing is going to be found. And so we often think of the law as the bitter thing, as the thing that, oh man, God giving us all these rules, and it's the opposite. God is saying, this is the way that I have for you, and through it, you're going to find healing. You're going to find sweetness. Jehovah Rapha, he says, I am the Lord who heals you. This word Rapha, it means to mend, to cure, to repair thoroughly, to make whole. It's the same word used in 1 Kings 18:30, where it says, "Then Elijah said to all the people, 'Come near to me.' And all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down." So it's to bring back to its original purpose, to repair it, to restore it back to what it once was. Psalm 103, 2-5 says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquity, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good things, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. He's promising to be his people's healer here. And he's saying it's going to be through their obedience to the law. And here's what we often miss. This promise of healing was conditional. The Israelites had to diligently listen to the voice of Yahweh. They had to do what was right in his eyes. They had to give ear to his commandments and keep all of his statutes. Now, if you've read the Old Testament, does this sound like God's people? If you have, you'll know that no, this doesn't sound like God's people. They didn't keep their end of the deal. They didn't follow him diligently. They didn't obey his commandments. They didn't do what was right in his eyes. They didn't because they couldn't. And that's where we see the fulfillment of what Jesus does for us on our behalf. And there's a lot of parallelism that goes on between this story and Jesus in the New Testament. In Matthew 4, we see some of the same language here taking place. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. So if you'll remember the passage that we're looking at in Exodus 15, it says, Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. So the Israelites have just come through a baptism of the Red Sea, and they're immediately led into the wilderness. Jesus is baptized, and he is led into the wilderness. This is not a coincidence. This is something that not only had to happen, but shows us the incredible greatness of God's promises and the fulfillment of those promises. Jesus accomplishes what the Israelites could not. Jesus accomplishes what you and I cannot do. He is the one who fulfills God's law. He is taken into the wilderness and he is tempted for 40 days and he succeeds. He comes out righteous. He doesn't disobey God. All of these commands that God has given to follow his ways, to do what is right in his ways, to obey diligently to the commands. The Israelites couldn't do it. You and I couldn't do it. But guess who could and who did? Jesus. He did it on our behalf. Isaiah 53:5 says, But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. 1 Peter 2:24 says, He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Jesus is the means by which the bitterness of sin is healed and our hearts become whole again, that we can be restored back to what we were made to be. And even though God's law is good, it doesn't have the power to save. Jesus did what we couldn't do. He obeyed perfectly on our behalf. It wasn't just his death and resurrection that were important, which both of those are vital. But the life that he lived was just as important. He had to fulfill God's law on our behalf so that his perfection, his righteousness could be given to us when we place our faith in him. And that's the great exchange. He made him who knew no sin to be sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. That's the good news of the gospel. That when we place our faith in Jesus for salvation, we actually receive his righteousness because he fulfilled God's law on our behalf. This is good news. So what does this mean? I want to talk about three things. First, the healing that we need most is the healing from sin. Here we have bitter water that's made sweet. And God says, I'm Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals you. We usually think of bitterness as the result of things that have been done to us. We're bitter because someone hurt us and we've chosen not to forgive, and it eats away at us. And that's true. Bitterness absolutely can come from not forgiving someone who's harmed us. But in our current culture, it seems that the more you are a victim, the more you're not only sympathized with, but you're actually celebrated. And so this has actually become the center focus of the healing that we need, is healing of wounds from what other people have done to us. And so many testimonies, I've gone to baptisms, I've listened to testimonies, and so often it's all about the wounds that they have from other people. And it's not mentioned very much about what Jesus has saved them from. Now, don't get me wrong. The things that have been done to us matter. Those wounds matter. This isn't to minimize our pain or say that God doesn't care. He most certainly does care. He cares about our broken hearts. He cares about the wounds, and he wants to bring healing into those places, into all the broken parts of our heart. But my biggest problem is not other people. My biggest problem is not what has been done to me. My biggest problem is me. My biggest problem is my own sin. And we have to understand that this is our biggest problem. Jesus didn't come to stand in solidarity with us in our victimhood. He came to make us right with God, to do what we could never do, and that was to fulfill God's law and bring us back into a right relationship with Him. The healing we need most from is the bitterness of our own sin. Our hearts are bitter because of sin, and it is only through Jesus and His fulfillment of God's law and His death and His resurrection that heals us. And so that's the first thing I want us to take away from this, is to evaluate our own hearts. Where is there bitterness from our own sin? Have we come face to face with it? Have we felt the weight of sin so that we can receive the weight of God's mercy through Jesus? The second thing I want us to look at is to ask the question of, who do we trust the most for our healing? Do we really turn to Jehovah Rapha for our healing? Whether it's for our spiritual healing or our emotional, our mental healing, or even our physical healing, who do we turn to the most? There's an interesting story in 2 Chronicles, and it's about King Asa. And in 2 Chronicles 16:12 it says, in the 39th year of his reign, Asa was diseased in his feet, and his disease became severe. Yet even in his disease he did not seek the Lord, but sought help from physicians. Now, don't get me wrong here. This is not saying that we shouldn't seek help from physicians. We shouldn't look to medicine or supplements or anything like that. God absolutely can use doctors. He can use medicine. He can use modern science. He can use all of that to heal. And it's not to say that we shouldn't seek that help or that medication is wrong. But the question is, do we take God's word as seriously as we would take a doctor's, or as we would take the health professional that we're following on social media, or the health influencer that we're following? Because we hang on their words, and we're pretty good at obeying them, aren't we? Philippians 4:6 says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. It says here, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything give thanks. And then it goes on to say that the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard our hearts and our mind. What if we took that prescription as seriously and as regularly as the supplements or the medication that we take? Again, I'm not saying throw the medication or the supplements away. What I am saying is, do we take God's word as seriously? Would we take this prescription as regularly as we do when we hear from the influencers or the health professionals? Do we take his word? What if we did? What if we took his word as seriously? What if we saw this as a prescription and we committed to taking it, to taking God at his word for our healing? What would happen? What difference would we see? Do we really trust God as our healer? Or are we looking to everything else and everyone else first and foremost? That's the question here. And then the third thing is that full healing and restoration is coming one day. We live in a world that is obsessed with healing. Spend a few hours on social media and you will see how deep this obsession is. We live in a broken and hurting world, and our bodies are affected by that. We live in a world where there's disease, where there's stress, where there is sickness, and where there's hurt. And so it's no wonder that we're seeking healing. And again, this is not to say that seeking help from these places is wrong, but we do have to remember that sometimes healing doesn't come. There's nothing wrong with pursuing health or praying for healing, and we can and should expect to do miracles, should expect God to do miracles. I've seen him perform miracles, and may we never make God out smaller than he is. He tells us to pray. He tells us to ask, and those are good things, and I believe that we will see him do miracles. But what happens when the healing doesn't come? What happens when the prayers aren't answered? What happens when our story involves suffering rather than celebration? And I see this a lot. A few years ago, I was a part of this women's group, and it was a beautiful group of women who really were serious about seeking the Lord and wanted to live lives that glorify him. And many of them were walking through pretty hard seasons of life. And we prayed for healing. We believed that God most certainly can and does heal. But then there would be a time of sharing, and several people would give prophetic words to other people. And interestingly, all of the words that were spoken into these situations that these women were facing, all of them, the word that they had was that God was going to heal bodies. God was going to fix broken relationships. He was going to restore lost dreams and fix all of these hard situations exactly as each person wanted him to. Now we can pray for this. We can believe for this, and I believe God can do this. But what if he doesn't? Because I've never heard anyone have a word from God for someone that says, you're going to suffer greatly for my kingdom. You're going to walk a really, really hard path. But I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be with you in the valley of the shadow of death. And you know what? You're not going to fear any evil because you are going to cling to me. And my presence is going to be so real and so intimate. And you are going to know me in a way that you never had before. And my love is going to sustain you. Have you ever heard someone give a word like that to someone? When God spoke to Ananias regarding Paul, do you know what his prophetic word was? In Acts 9:15-16, it says, "But the Lord said to him, 'Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name.'" That's not the kind of thing we put on graduation cards, is it? Is God enough for you if the healing doesn't come? Is his presence enough to get us through the valley of the shadow of death? Do we have a theology of suffering that's going to sustain us when God's good plan for our lives involves deep suffering and pain? Jesus' word for his disciples was that they were going to be hated, They were going to be mocked, they were going to be ridiculed, they were going to be persecuted, and they were going to be martyred for his name's sake. The greatest healing we need is healing from our own sin, and that is a guarantee. We are guaranteed that healing when we place our trust and our faith in Jesus and his finished work on our behalf. The healing we're not guaranteed this side of heaven is the other types of healing. The healing that we want, that we long for. And again, let's pray for it. Let's believe it. Let's have faith that God can do miraculous things in our lives. But if it doesn't come, if the healing doesn't come in the way that we want it, in the way that we expect it, will we still call him Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals us? And that's where we get to the last part of this story. And it's the part of the story that it's really easy to just kind of jump over because it's so short. In Exodus 15:27 it says, "Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water." If you read most commentaries or Bible study notes, this will just be a quick comment on how God provided rest for his people after their bitter experience at Marah, and something like from the bitterness of Marah to the sweetness of Elim. And it certainly was a time of rest and refreshment for God's people. But again, there's something deeper and something more significant going on. So the location of Elim is debated. There's several possibilities proposed amongst scholars, but what's important is what it symbolizes. We have 12 springs and we have 70 palm trees. If you are an ancient Israelite or an ancient person reading this, those numbers you understand are significant. First of all, 12 springs, they represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And the 70 palm trees all throughout the Bible. We have this imagery of one, Eden, but also in the temple. The temple is decorated with palm trees all over the place. It's beautiful. 1 Kings 6:29 says, "Around all the walls of the house, he carved engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers in the inner and outer courts." Psalm 92:12-13 says, "The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon." And remember Moses' song, Exodus 15:17, "You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established." God is giving his people a glimpse back to Eden, the place where God dwells with his people, the place where there is true healing and true refreshment. But the number 70 is also significant here. In Genesis 10, we have the table of nations, and there's 70 nations. And remember, at Babel, there was the scattering of those nations, the giving over to these other gods, and God taking Israel as his own portion so that through Israel, he would reclaim those nations back to himself. So here, before Israel goes into the promised land, before they're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness, before he gives them his law and his tabernacle, he's giving them a glimpse of what total healing is going to be, total restoration is going to be. He's giving them a glimpse back to Eden, to the new Eden. And you know who's there? Not just the 12 tribes of Israel. The nations. The nations are there too. And this has been God's plan from the beginning. Eden, where we were originally meant to dwell, and who we were originally meant to be as God's image bearers, God's dwelling with his people, with all the nations. 70 is also symbolic in the Bible for totality or completeness. This is more than just a resting place. God is showing his people both their mission for now and their ultimate destination. He is telling his people, through you, I'm going to reclaim the nations. Through you, I have called out Israel as my portion. Remember that he told Abraham, I'm blessing you so that you will be a blessing, so that through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed, both in the short term of showing the nations who Yahweh is by the way that they live, by living according to his law, but ultimately through the line of Abraham, the serpent crusher is going to come and is going to reclaim these nations. And then for us, that Jesus tells us, go now. All authority has been given to me. It's done. I've crushed sin. I've crushed the serpent. Go now and make disciples of who? All the nations. Because one day, he's going to restore us back to Eden. And Israel will be there. And the church will be there. One body. One church. And people from all nations will be there. Revelation 21, 2-4 says, And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. He is Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals us. The biggest healing we need is from our own sin. And we have to remember that healing might not come this side of heaven physically. Our spiritual healing is guaranteed through Jesus, but we might not receive the healing that we want for our bodies this side of heaven. But God promises that he is Jehovah Rapha, and one day he's going to wipe away every tear. Death will be no more. Sadness will be no more. Sickness will be no more. And so let's get a glimpse here of Elim, the place where God takes his people after the bitter waters of Marah, where he turns the bitter water sweet. And he says, all right, this is what it's going to be. You and me and the nations. So remember, this is your mission now. This is your mission. And it's our mission that even though the law doesn't save us, because only Jesus could complete it, but now God asks us to live lives that represent him to the nations, just like he did with Israel. And we have the power of the Holy Spirit within us if we are in Christ, to show who God is by the way that we live our lives, that his commandments are sweet. His commandments are meant to make our lives sweet and not bitter, to heal us, and so that we can show the watching world who is so desperate, who is lost in darkness, who God is. And then to remember that one day he's going to restore us. And that true healing, that true rest after the bitterness of life, we will rest with him. But God, Yahweh, dwells with his people. And we're there. Those 12 springs and those 70 palm trees. Will you trust in Jehovah Rapha as your healer today?